All right, welcome back. So this is our third video on making this sword asset, and in this video we're going to start making some procedural materials for this. So where we left off was we had finished doing the UV unwrapping for the sword, and we created this UV grid material which sort of just helps us to see where there's like stretching or misalignment in the UVs of the mesh. So we did this last time, and you can see we've got all of these UVs. We talked about sort of the scale of these and stuff, but for the moment this will work for our purposes. So the next thing we're going to do is actually remove that material from all our objects and get started working on our metal. So I'm going to go, let's start with the blade and let's remove it from everything. And on this blade, I'm going to create a new material slot. That's going to create a new material, and I'm going to call it steel. So we're going to make a medieval looking metal for this. So let's go ahead and move over into the shading tab so that we can start looking at this material. Now I was looking at some reference images for old swords in particular, and they all have this sort of like a little bit worn sort of pitted steel on them. If you look at like a lot of newer stuff, newer metals, it's like completely shiny and it doesn't really have that sort of older look to it. I thought something like this looked nice, and so we're going to make something that looks a little bit like this, where we've got sort of some pitted marks in the steel, and we're going to do this all procedurally. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set a metallic value of maybe 0.9. We could turn it all the way up to 1, I guess. It is metal, but I found that just like having it slightly lower looks a little bit better for something like this. And in particular, that's mostly because even though it is all metal, it's not actually all metal because it has sort of oxidized on the outside of the surface, and so it's got some sort of like markings and stuff on the outside covering up some of that metal. So the appearance that you see from a distance is sort of a mixture of like metal and oxides and dirt and dust and stuff. The next thing I'm going to add is a noise texture. So I'm going to go Shift A, texture, noise texture, and I'm going to Control Shift click, and that will show us what this noise texture looks like. And by the way, in order to do this, you have to have the Node Wrangler plugin enabled. We did this in a previous video, but in case you don't have it turned on, go into Preferences, Add-ons, and search for Node Wrangler, and just make sure that that's plugged in. And again, what this is going to do is when you Control-Shift click on any node, it is going to show you just that node as the output. So I'm going to Control-Shift click on this noise texture so that we can see it. And so our noise texture is now applied to the object. The only thing is it's not using our UV map that we created, and so it looks a little bit stretched. So what we can do is, again, and this also requires having the Node Wrangler enabled, if you click on this node and you hit Control-T, it will automatically add a texture coordinate node and a mapping node and plug them in. You can also add those nodes manually with Shift A and just search for those nodes if you for some reason don't want to use the Node Wrangler, but we're going to do that and just make sure that this mapping node is plugged into our noise texture, and on this texture coordinate I'm just going to plug UV into the vector. And so now this is going to use that UV map that we created to apply this texture to the surface of our object. And it may be a little bit hard to see because this noise texture is quite large. And so what I'm going to do is let's change the scale to something like 10 and the detail to something like 6 maybe, and turn the roughness up to like 1. And now you can see we've got like this mottled texture on here where we've got some actual like noisiness going on the surface of the object. And actually maybe let's even turn the scale up to maybe more like 20. That's pretty good. Something like that size. And so you can see that like we've got this noisy texture on the surface of our object, And now what we want to do is we want to use that to drive the roughness. Now what's coming out of this channel is, you can see we've got like white and then sort of dark gray. But because this is metal, we want this pattern, but we want the range of values to be more from like very dark gray to less dark gray. And the reason is that that's what's going to determine how rough the surface is. And for metal, you generally want the roughness to be low so that it's reflective. And in order to do that, we need to bring down the sort of the scale of or the range of these values, so that instead of going from white to dark gray, it goes from like a gray to a darker gray, so that we have a range of values, but our minimum and maximum are all still relatively low roughness. I hope that makes sense to you, and you can do that with a color ramp. So we're gonna Shift A, search for color ramp, and I'm just gonna drop it in here. So our noise texture factor is going into the factor of the color ramp. And if I Control Shift click the color ramp now, we can preview its output. And what we want to do is we want to drag this black node here sort of towards the middle. And I ended up settling on a color of 545454 for that middle node, which is like this dark gray. And you can see what that looks like here. And then for this white, I went with a color of, and you can just click on the handle and then click down here on this color bar to change it. 7777. All sevens, 6 sevens. And that's like just a slightly lighter dark gray. And so you can see like the effect is pretty subtle, but we have a difference in roughness from, very smooth to, slightly less smooth, but still quite smooth. And we can now take that output and plug it into our roughness. And if I Control Shift click the principled BSDF, you can see, if we look around, and I don't know how well you'll be able to see it on the stream, but we've got it, some sort of modeling going on in the background, so it's not completely smooth. And this is going to add a lot to the realism of this material. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to also add in that sort of like aged, pitted, rusted areas to this, and we can do that again with noise textures. So I'm gonna just click this noise texture and Shift D to duplicate it down, and then I'm gonna add something else. I'm gonna go Shift A, texture, Voronoi texture, and I'm just gonna take the color output from the noise and I'm going to plug it into the vector input on the Voronoi. And if I Control Shift click now on the Voronoi, you should be able to see what's coming out of here, and it's stretched again because I didn't plug in our UV mapping here. So let's plug that in to the noise vector. There we go. And now you can see this is going to be our map for how we create that sort of pitted, rusted looking appearance. So let's go ahead and take the distance output from our Voronoi and plug it into the base color and see how that looks. And I just Control Shift click on the principled BSDF to bring that back. I'm also going to turn the Voronoi scale up to 6. Something like that's probably okay. And I also think, for me at least, it's a little bit too strong. And so we can restrict the range of those colors using a color ramp. So I'm going to drag and drop a color ramp here after this Voronoi, and so the Voronoi distance is going into the color ramp, and then the color output of the color ramp is going into our base color. And so let's Control Shift click on the color ramp to preview what that's looking like. And I'm just going to drag down this white handle here a bit, and that's just going to restrict this a little bit so that it's not so overpowering. So we do have some marks on our blade, but they're not sort of like covering it entirely. So if I go into rendered preview mode, you can see what this is looking like so far. And it's looking pretty okay. The only thing is it looks very flat, right? And it's because we haven't added any sort of like bumpiness to the surface of this. And so what we want to do in order to get this looking really a lot more real is to actually add some depth to this. And we can do that using a bump map or a normal map. So we're going to create a bump map, and to do that, down here, I'm just going to go Shift A, and I'm going to search for bump. There we go. And now we need something to plug into the height input of our bump map. And what I'd like to do is to have both the roughness and also sort of these darker pitted areas sort of reflected in the bumpiness of the surface. And so we can mix them together using a mix node. So I'm going to go Shift A, search mix, and grab a mix node. And if you're using an older version of Blender, again, there used to be a node called Mix RGB. So if you are on, I think Blender 3.4 maybe, or 3.3 is when they added that. In the newer versions of Blender, we just have a mix node, and it has a drop-down menu where we can change its type to color. But if you don't have that and you're on an older version of Blender, then search for Mix RGB, and it will bring up this node, and it does the same thing. So now we're going to mix our roughness with our base color in order to generate that sort of bumpy look across the surface. Now we want the bump to be pretty subtle, and this that we set up here, right, this is really set up for our roughness, but we don't want it to be that sort of extreme for our bumpiness. And so what we can do is hit Shift A, search color ramp again. And so you can see, again, we're just sort of restricting the range of the color data that's coming out of these nodes to get what we're after. And so if I Control Shift click the noise texture that we used to make our roughness map, you can see it's got like dark gray and light gray, and really we want it to be quite subtle. So I can take the output from this factor and plug it into this color ramp. Control Shift click our color ramp to preview it, and I'm just going to take this black and turn it to something like this. Right, so we've got maybe even less than that. Very, very subtle, a white going to a whiter light, and maybe I'll sort of even restrict it like that a little bit. And so now I'll take this output and plug it into the A on our mix node, and take our base color map that we made down here and plug it into the B on the mix node. And the result of this, I'm going to plug into the height of our bump. And now if I plug this normal into the normal on our output, and then Control Shift click back on our principled BSTF to preview that, you should see now we've got bumpiness sort of all over the surface of our object here. The only issue is that the bumpiness is way too strong, and so I'm going to go down here to the strength and turn it down to maybe like 0.02, something like that. And I actually think that this still is a bit too strong. So on this color ramp here, this is the noise texture that sort of we used for our roughness map. And it's really hard to see here when we preview it, but it is coming out in the bump map. So if I just go here and drag this white down, drag this white handle, you can see that the effect gets more and more subtle. So you can make this maybe like a very white color, and then just drag this handle down, something like that maybe. You can see that now we've got a much better looking metal. And actually, I'm going to change the metallic here. I know I said to put it at 0.9, but I think this is a little too bright. I'm just going to drag it all the way up to 1. And there you go. So now you can see how just through using procedural texturing, we're able to get a very realistic looking metallic material pretty quickly. Now I want to do one more thing in this video, and that is I want to create a sharpened edge, and we're going to need to create a new material for that. And that's pretty easy to do because we've already got a metal material set up, so we can base it on that. But first, we need to sharpen this edge up. So I'm just going to turn the level of subdivision on the blade's subsurface modifier down to 1 and then hit apply. And then this will be easier in this view mode to see this edge here. I want it to be uniform distance from the edge of the blade all the way around. And so what we can do is we can hit GG to edge slide and then E, and it will sort of snap that so that it matches the shape of the outer edge there. And just edge slide to where it looks about the right distance, and then left click to confirm. And then the same thing on the other side. So GG, E, F. So E and F are the keys that change the orientation of this, and then click to confirm. Something like that is probably good. By the way, if you ever notice that when you're getting in really close to a mesh, part of it starts to like disappear like this, and it's really hard to see when you're working on like very small geometry, that's because of the clipping distance, and you can actually change that. If I hit N here under view, we have view, clip start, and clip end. I'm going to change the clip start to 0.001, and you can see that now we have to zoom in much further before it starts to clip that geometry. So I'm going to go into face select mode and alt click this edge to select this face on the outside edge, and alt shift click to select this on the other side. And then in the materials for this object, I'm going to add a new material slot. I'm going to make a new material, and I'm going to hit assign. And so now in this preview mode, you can see we've got our metal, and then we've got this new material applied just to the edge of the blade. And what we're going to do is we're going to create sort of a brushed steel material for there. And that's really, really easy to do. So on this steel, if we select this, we can hit copy material. And then if we click on the slot for this new material, let's call it brushed steel, and then I'm going to go to this little arrow here, and I'm going to hit paste material. And what that does is it copies all of the properties from this material that we copied into the one that we pasted it onto. So now these are the same, but they're different materials, so we can change one and the other one will stay the same. So if I go into this shading tab now, and I want to create a brushed material for this edge, we can actually do that just by stretching the material out. So I'm going to go to the Y scale here and set it to a value of like, I don't know, 200, something like that. And you can see it's pretty subtle. If I apply it to the whole blade, you can see what's going on here, where we've got a brushed steel material here. And so that's what's going to give us that appearance that sort of the edge has been sharpened. So I'll change that slot back to our normal steel, and so now, and we can reposition this a little bit so maybe it's a little more visible with GG. Now on the outer edge of that blade, we have that brushed steel material. All right, so that's looking pretty good. If we wanted to, you could just apply this brushed steel directly to the guard as well, and you can see that does a pretty good job of making sort of a nice material here. And actually, why don't we do that? Let's use that brushed steel material for the guard and our original blade steel for the pommel, and then we just have to work on the handle. All right, so that's it for this video. We learned how to make procedural metal. We learned how to make a brushed steel, as well as sort of an older style, like medieval metal. And in the next video, we're going to make maybe a wood or leather or something for the handle.